Sam, welcome to B&S About Movies. This is a special episode. I got the extreme pleasure to get a chance to spend about a half an hour with David Gregory, one of the many people behind, but one of the main people behind Severin, and ask a lot of questions, especially about the Russ Meyer films that are just being released, as well as going into what makes a Severin film, what are some of his favorite films that have come out, and what are some of the things behind the process of releasing them. I really appreciate everybody that helped me put this interview together, and really appreciate David's time for sitting down with me and going through a lot of my fanboy questions. So take a listen. Thanks. I talked to Kayla Janice a while back, and she referred to you as the Filmmaker Whisperer. Was her nickname for you. She said that somehow, like, all of these people that she spoke to that would not give her the time of the day, you spent 2 minutes with them and suddenly they were like, yeah, take everything. Here's all this footage that wouldn't even know existed. Is that true?
Well, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, she's pretty good at tracking down filmmakers and rights owners herself, but there has been a few situations where I've just been very persistent in going after titles in ways that other people might have given up. And certainly when I get to the right person, you know, I certainly do make an effort to make a case why Severin is the best home for a given film or a given collection. And that was the case with the Meyer estate. We had to go to some lengths in order to convince them that we were the right people to do this.
Gosh, was it years that you put into this to try to get them to release the films?
Well, I first tried to actually get the films for other companies back when I was working at Blue Underground. So in the early 2000s, I think there was a couple of companies who were trying to do it, and I was consulting for a couple of other labels as well. And I did put in a pretty substantial offer, I think, back then. It didn't go anywhere. But no, this latest situation came around a couple of years before the actual releases, where there was actually an intermediary who had been talking with the estate, and he came to us, and that was when we had to start, making the case for why we're the right company. I mean, Janice at the trust, who is kind of the ultimate decision maker there. She was concerned that we were more of a horror label, and so it wouldn't be a good match. But we were able to show our pedigree of all the various genres, including erotic films from around the world that we've restored and released and remastered as well.
That's awesome. I'm so excited that these are coming out, because my biggest worry was that it was really, if you knew the right places to look, but if you weren't someone that was going to go through gray market means to get Russ Meyer movies, it was really hard for folks to find them outside of the ones that Criterion had put out. So the fact that these movies are somewhat re-entering the circulation, I think, is amazing. I never wanted him to become a lost director or somebody whose work was hard to find. Did you feel that kind of responsibility?
And I'm not sure that the trust ever wanted that to happen either. It's just taken time for them to be able to find a company that will do it in the way that they, not only that they think is the right home for the place, because there's other boutique labels who can, do the work just as well as we have. But they wanted things like to retain Russ's graphic design for the covers, for example, and we actually designed them before we even signed the contract to show that we agree, we want them to look like the way Russ had the VHSs, but just updated to the Blu-ray and UHD sizing. So those were the kinds of things that were sort of like, we wanted to go the extra lengths even before signing the deal to show that we were on board.
That was my favorite thing when I got them. I was like, oh wow, this is just like the video cassette that I owned, like 25, 30 years ago.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because those video cassettes were everywhere back in the video era. So it really wasn't hard to see Russ Meyer's films in the video era. And even Laserdisc, a lot of them were available on Laserdisc too. But he had started to deteriorate. His mental health had started to deteriorate, in the early days of DVD. So he never really jumped, even though he was ahead of the game quite often in the previous technologies, in order to get all of his stuff out there, distributing it himself, taking the phone calls famously at his house, and you had to order copies from him. So that just kind of fell by the wayside when he wasn't able to kind of keep up once the DVD era kicked in. And they did do some of the DVDs themselves, but they they use the existing masters, which of course when VHS came in, they were state of the art transfers, but they are far from state of the art. That technology moves on quite a bit and quite quickly, and so but there was no resistance on the part of the trust. In fact, quite the opposite. They wanted to make sure that these were now state of the art transfers, and I think that was another thing. They needed to make sure that these were being done to the best possible specs that they could be.
It's amazing to have them, because in my head I experienced them as the video cassettes, so I know like how scenes look and how colors look, and now to see these now, it's like it's getting a chance, almost without getting too hyperbolic, to see a new movie, like to see new things of them. And that's probably the most exciting thing for me.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the same when we were watching the transfers as the scan, once we watched the scans as they were being color corrected and restored. It was leaps and bounds that like above what we had seen before. And that is the point of upgrading things like this. But we went to extra lengths on these, particularly on Beneath the Valley of the Ultra Vixens, which was the one that had damage to the negative. But, we certainly didn't want it to look ropey when we're going to this trouble. So we had to put in a lot of hours to get rid of some of the moisture damage on the negative. Also, the aspect ratio, on they'd only been, shown on their open matte versions before, which is not the way that they were shot and supposed to be exhibited.
That's my favorite Russ movie. So it's like getting to see that in like as perfect a format as we can. It was like, wow, this is like, it is, to me, it was the biggest story of physical media last year. Like, this is the stuff that I want to come out. Like, when it's so funny when I see and there's great other labels, but like, you guys are like the Criterion Collection of the movies that I like, if you will. I was a big fan of Night Killer before you guys put it out. I'm like, that seems like such a Severin movie. And then when you guys grabbed it, I was like, this is exactly perfect. Like, this is a film that fishes.
That's very much in our, yeah, exactly. That sort of thing is very much in our remit. I mean, certainly the umbrella of what we do has expanded quite a bit over the last few years, but I want to think that we've stayed true to what we always were. It's just we've incorporated more voices and more people into deciding what that roster of films is.
Yeah, I've read in an interview where you said you feel like you're almost putting together a team of people like that, like almost like how studios had like that group of folks, like a Corman kind of group of folks. And I think that's amazing. Like, what makes someone able to work for you, and also like what makes a Severin film like that? You're like, this feels like us, and this feels like it would be true to our ethos.
Well, the first part is, it was more kind of something I sort of realized when we did our annual Super Shock Festival last year, when I had, the team that we, either the full-time employees or the people who work with us a lot as freelancers, all gathered together in Los Angeles, and we have this all-day event, all afternoon and night event where we show 3 new releases. We don't tell anybody what it is ahead of time, and they get to hear about them first. And so it was then when we're sort of all hanging out back, and I'm just sort of looking around, and I was like, I always was really inspired by John Waters in particular in Shock Value, when he talked about his stock company of like-minded people who would go on these adventures with him and make these movies, all bringing their own kind of creativity and uniqueness to the package. It's not all just John at the top and everybody does what he says. It's like everybody brings something to it, and Ed Wood had that, or Ray Steckler had that, and that's a lot of independents have that for a number of reasons. You need people who are going to sort of just roll with it in order to be able to make low budget movies and actually get them done. But in this case, I realized, that yes, we sort of have that now, and while we're not necessarily going out and making movies the way they did, we're definitely using all our own kind of unique charms to and expertise in order to bring things to the table, and that makes me really happy. And then as far as what constitutes a Severin film, well, it often it's ultimately my decision. I mean, there are exceptions, like the box sets that Kayla does, for example. She's the one who's really making those choices. I mean, she still ultimately has to run them by me, but in a lot of cases, I don't even know what these films are. So I'm trusting her, deep knowledge of cinema that is beyond mine, to actually bring interesting stuff to the table. And really, that's it. It's stuff that interests us. We all are into kind of the same movies. And so, there are slightly different age groups now, though. I mean, I realize now that I'm kind of in the older age group. So when some of the Intervision stuff came up, which was shot on video, that was not my cup of tea at all. But I could see in the people, a decade or more younger than me, they did grow up finding that stuff and finding it really interesting and fun. And so it doesn't get counted out just because it's not my cup of tea.
Yeah.
As long as it's something that one of us is passionate about, and it doesn't look too out of place in the Severin line, which at this point, now that we've got Mike Leigh movies and Overboard, it's like it can stretch pretty wide.
What was the reason behind Overboard? I've always been interested that was a release. Was it just trying to expand?
It was. No, I've told this story before.
I'm sure you have. Yeah.
No. It's all right. But I just, people are like, oh God, this story again. But basically, it was a drunken license, is what it was.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I was in Santa Barbara with my partner and a couple of friends, and one of the friends, she started talking about how she loves Overboard, and we started talking about how there's a lot of gaslighting in that movie. There's a lot wrong about that movie, and I rather facetiously said it wouldn't look out of place next to The Sinful Dwarf, and we all laughed. Said, "Oh, can you imagine if there was a Severin version of Overboard?" And so I actually texted my colleague who was making an offer to MGM for some other titles, put in an offer for Overboard. This would be hilarious, and then they accepted the offer. So we ended up, there was no going back at that point, and so we did. And it was a movie I actually like, and a movie that we were happy to put out. But it is kind of funny that it's that it came about just because of its similarities to something like The Sinful Dwarf.
I like seeing it on con tables next to your other releases. That's my favorite thing when you guys have the tables.
It's one of those things. It's like, well, what's the odd man out here? And it's like, well, you say that, but if you look at the subtext,
I like hearing people that aren't aware of the label when they're looking at stuff for the first time. Like, why do they have Overboard on this table? And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Which is a great one. What do you think is there like a perfect release or a release you think best sums up the label, or a favorite release?
Well, there's many. I mean, because there are films that we really go to town on because they are the old. Santa Sangre is probably a good example because it's one of my favorite movies, and it's one that really is just a masterpiece of cinema in general. But when we did the first Blu-ray and DVD, I wanted to interview as many people from the making of the movie because I hadn't really seen anyone talking about it except for Jodorowsky. There were so many interesting characters in the making of this movie. So we did a full feature-length documentary on that. That was for the first release. So when we came to the UHD and we got Jodorowsky to actually supervise the color correction and in 4K, was like, well, we need to do more stuff. So there were a lot of people on the Italian side of things that hadn't been interviewed. Claudio Argento, for example, that hadn't been included on the previous disc. So there was a whole host of more featurettes on that. But then of course the packaging has become so important as well. So I think the design of that cover is beautiful, and the whole we got the guy who designed all the tattoos, Sergio Arau, his name is, who is a filmmaker in his own right. He did A Day Without a Mexican. He's also a rock star in Mexico, fairly famous rock star in Mexico, and also a political cartoonist. And I think that's why he was hired to do the tattoos on the tattooed woman. And he now lives in LA, and I basically asked him to do kind of the stages of the cross, but only 4 of them, to actually be the backdrop of the 4 discs in there. So it's so things like that made it really kind of something that we were very pleased with.
I was so excited when you put that up because that was a very formative movie for me, because my hometown mom and pop video store got that movie. I grew up in a really small town next to Pittsburgh. Why they ordered it, I probably came in a package of stuff, but it just went in the horror section. And I was a 13-year-old kid that got every horror movie that came out. I brought it home, and imagine like only seeing slashers and suddenly that's what you're confronted with. And it changed
Yeah.
the way that I saw movies, right? So I think your label's done that for a lot of folks too. So I think that's a really cool place to be in.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that. I mean, and
Yeah.
Santa Sangre is the perfect example of that because it really is, an Italian slasher movie, but
Mhm.
done by Horowski. So not like an Italian slasher movie at all. It has the kind of basics there,
Yeah.
but then done through his kind of phantasmagorical lens.
It's a nexus of influences where you can go off and be like, oh, this person that did this movie that I love, they're involved with it too. It's like these connections of it. It's like such a weird connective tissue between other movies and cultures that I love.
Even something like Hell of the Living Dead,
Mhm.
which we just did, is a silly movie to a lot of people, and it is a silly
I
movie,
love
but
it.
it's a movie
It's one of my
that
favorite movies.
yeah, I'm very fond of that as Zombie Creeping Flesh as I saw it, and it was also, as I mentioned on my podcast, it was also very formative for me because that was that film specifically where I realized that the government and the powers that be are liars and basically will say whatever it is that fits their agenda. And so for that to be a realization at like 11 or 12 years old, when I was watching it at home, and all of a sudden my dad comes in and sees that I'm watching it and says it's been in the newspapers. This is going to be banned. I was like, just look at it. Why would you ban this film, particularly in the cut version that was out in the UK? So anyway, coming back to doing that, when we finally got the rights to that, I'm like, this we're giving a super duper special edition to because I'd worked on the previous editions from Blue Underground, and then the rights came to us, and so I wanted to go many steps further. I wanted to do the full. I used the Zombie Creeping Flesh title on the back of the wrap. I had a 7-inch single when I was a kid by Peter and the Test Tube Babies, the punk band. I wanted to interview them about why they did a song called Zombie Creeping Flesh. And then, of course, we got Brad Carter to do like a novelization. And boy, did he take that and run with it. I mean, it's something like 500 pages that he did of a novelization of Hell of the Living Dead, which is, quite something.
I love the movie a lot because obviously growing up in Pittsburgh, Dawn of the Dead is going to be a really important movie to me. So I love that when
Yeah.
Bruno Mattei gets this job to like, hey, make a version of Dawn of the Dead that's maybe a little happier. It's not. It's even more depressing than Dawn.
And it's actually probably inspired more by Fulci's Zombie than it is
Yeah,
by Dawn of the Dead.
yeah.
Even though that whole beginning bit with the
The
SWAT
police
team
action.
going in,
Yeah.
yeah, that's clear. That's a bit that could easily be cut out and means nothing to the overall film. But yeah, it was definitely that kind of thing. But it is a bleak movie, and that was kind of the whole point that Claudio Fragasso and Rosella Drudi, who wrote it when they were very young, they wrote this epic treatment for what the film was going to be, like naively thinking that this is what they could make with the budget they had, and that of course was completely thrown out for the script that ended up being made. But that is what Brad used as the impetus for his novelization. He worked with Claudio and Rosella at the beginning stages to find out what their original global world zombie apocalypse story was all about.
I love the scene where just the politicians are kind of losing it and throwing paper at each other. And it's like, I hate when people watch this movie and only see one side of it. This is how I know who I can watch movies with. Rick, well, that movie's dumb. Yes, big chunks of it are dumb. There's also something to it. Like there's a lot of darkness and like commentary on stuff. And it's also willing, as I'm sure you know, like the reason I love Italian movies is you have no idea what's going to happen. Like an American movie, that child would not get shot. Do you know what I mean? And like the ending, the main character, spoiler, would not get killed at the end of the movie. Like this is like you're in a maniac's hands and just go for the ride, that's what I love about that film.
Exactly. And a lot of it was sort of about, well, what elements do we necessarily need here? It's like it doesn't, and often it seemed like, well, we don't need it to make absolute narrative sense for a start. And then secondly, as long as it's got certain elements. But of course, all the filmmakers who were doing these things, no matter what resources they were given by the producers, they were going to do it as well as they possibly could. And that's why interesting work came out of it, even though it's rough around the edges, because it's so low budget, and they had to make do with what they had. They never like half-assed it, So even if they knew that what they were doing would probably turn out to be a little hokey, they're not going to like turn their back on it saying, I'm above this. You know, once
Yeah.
they took it, they took it seriously.
What's like Shocking Dark that you put out is similar to me, where it's like, I love the idea that it's like, this is a work for hire thing, and we're making this movie that is a ripoff of two other movies. But within that, there's still room for art. Like magic can come out of it. And like, it's almost like alchemy that when that happens, that you have this like,
That's right.
this movie that is more memorable to me than maybe some of the movies that inspire it. Like I think about Shocking Dark way too much, maybe, but that's the beauty of it. It's an amazing
It
film.
is.
And Robo War is another one. Like all those that you put out, like I love that there was a whole industry to do this at one point where it was like if pre-Blockbuster, like even before Blockbuster's made, I love that like Martino were in the same hotel they were making Over the Top, and he's like, we should probably have an arm wrestling scene in Hands of Steel because arm wrestling movies are going to be huge. They weren't. There was only one. But I love that. Like,
exactly.
Like let's jump in and do it. Like let's get it before they get it.
That's exactly right. And again, all that Shocking Dark and I mean Robo War in particular, and the stuff they did in the Philippines. It's like, you know, that's not easy to pull off with little to no money. I mean the actual infrastructure they had for filmmaking was very limited back then. But what they did have was things like, helicopters and stunt people who didn't mind jumping out of a house that was on fire or blowing up or those kinds of things. So you did actually get this production value that and imagery that you wouldn't necessarily get in anything else.
I think, I don't know when it happened in my life, but I enjoy the ripoffs, do you know what I mean, more than the real thing at this point, because it's like, quite conversely, if somebody rips off a Bava shot, I'm like, I hate this. It's, you know, it's reverse racism, I guess. Like if Italian filmmakers do it, I'm like, great, genius steals. If American ones do it, I'm like, these hacks, like what is wrong with them? I don't know where I developed this double standard. But has there been anything, a release you've worked to get, I'm sure legally, maybe a few that you can't say, but something you really worked hard to get and weren't able to get it, that would be like, that would have been perfect for us?
Trying to think. I mean, there's plenty of films that we get that we're unable to get. You know, I mean, often when people send us like lists of titles, these films haven't been out for a while, or these films have never been out. Often there's a reason that they're not out. Often, you know, more often than not, they have already been considered, explored, and usually it's because they're owned by a major studio, so we can't get them, or it's not worth getting them for the price that the studios need. But yeah, I can't think of any example where we actually, I mean, except for right at the beginning of our career, Carl and I, when we were running a VHS label in England, we had a deal for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We had a deal in place, and we had like the deal memo came through. But I spoke to the censor at the time, James Furman, telling him, asking him, don't you think it's about time that this film should be allowed now? You know, the video nasties thing is now over a decade old. Decade and a half almost at that point. So can we just accept that this is a great film and not dangerous to society? And he said absolutely not, and there's no way to even cut the film because, you know, it would be under an hour long, and then you'd have to cut most of the second half out and blah blah blah. And so we had to let that deal go. Fast forward a couple of years, and Furman has been walked out of the censors, quite rightly, for just being finally for just making decisions and ignoring all evidence and what his remit was in that job. And he got walked out of there. A new guy came in and we're like, okay, let's go back and get this deal, because surely nobody else on the planet actually thinks this movie is actually dangerous, which was correct. But another enterprising company had already licensed the film, knowing that the new guy was coming in, and they made a fortune out of it. But the good thing from that was that I ended up making Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Shocking Truth, just because I was like, damn it, I'm going to do something on my favorite movie no matter what. And so that's when I met Gunnar Hansen, and that's kind of started that documentary and really kind of started me in featurette making.
Do you find as much joy in making the featurettes and in the documentaries as you do in releasing things?
Yeah, but now I'm more inclined to find subjects where I can actually make a substantial feature out of, like Enter the Clones of Bruce or Al Adamson or Susanna, which is the one we just did for the folk horror set. So those are the things that kind of excite me, because they're not stories that have been told too many times before. So I feel like they need to have, because now so many of us have interviewed the same people about the same film so many times that it's not quite as exciting to go back and do another interview with Claudio Simonetti about Suspiria or whatever it may be. You know, I love Suspiria and I love Claudio Simonetti, but it's like it's been done 1,000 times now, you know? So I'm more likely to get excited about stuff that hasn't been done before, which is not as easy to find, of course, because now in the last 20 years we have thousands of times more interviews on camera than we ever had before the DVD era, you know, and not just that I've done, that tons of people have done all around the world, you know.
I always worry that there's going to be, that there isn't this bottomless pit of stuff. Like, am I going to run out of movie drugs, as I call them? Do you know what I mean? Am I going to run out?
I don't think we are, just because there's so many things that even on my whiteboards over here, there's so many films that haven't actually been out before, or certainly haven't been out for a while, or certainly haven't been out with an English-friendly subtitle track, or whatever it may be. I mean, but then there's always going to be the need to upgrade opera, you know, or you know, when a new technology comes in, a big film like opera, a major film like opera, or even Sangre, that needs to be on that best possible format. You know, you can't just leave opera in the Blu-ray world. It needs bringing up to date. But even though I don't do so much stuff for other labels anymore, hardly ever now, but Dawn of the Dead was one that I worked on for the Second Sight edition, and so going to the Monroeville Mall and with Tom Savini and Tasso Stavrakis and Mike Gornick and Tom Dubensky, like walking around the Monroeville Mall with those guys, going, "This is where this happened. This is where this happened." That was just phenomenal. And you know, so Dawn of the Dead, personal favorite of mine. So actually, just doing the Hajj to the Monroeville Mall itself was exciting enough. But then to do it as a featurette, because again, Dawn of the Dead, a lot has been said about Dawn of the Dead, you know, over the years. So we had to find something that was a bit of a different angle.
But also a movie that hasn't had like a U.S. release in a while. Do you know what I mean? Because of the rights issues. Martin's the same way. Like, I'm like, I wish more people knew.
Yeah, and we got to go to Bradock for Martin as well with Dubinsky, Savini, and Gornick. Sadly, Tony Buba was not in Gornick that day, which is a real bummer because he is Mr. Bradock. I mean, he's basically made tons of documentaries about Bradock, and you know, had I been able to actually, had I had the foresight, I would have actually changed the schedule so that we could actually have him there. But, you know, he's in the documentary, but he's not there when we're walking around town. Fun with the other guys because they were still like, oh, isn't this where this happened? Isn't this where that happened? So that was still kind of fun. And the town still looks like that kind of rundown town that they were depicting in Martin. I really loved going to those, like the stuff I do with Steve Thrower, where we go to all the Franco locations. I love doing that stuff because, you know, it breaks it out from the talking head formats, which is everywhere. I mean, it's still necessary to get people to tell the stories, but to actually go to a place and have them point things out just opens it out a bit.
As someone that grew up during the Video Nasties era and in England, and now you're here, have you felt like I feel like the younger generation, like younger than me, I'm 52, so anybody younger than me, but it feels more puritanical here. Oh, great. But it feels more puritanical here. And like when young folks get on film Twitter and are complaining about sex scenes in movies, and there were complaints about, you know, the Franco influenced cover on that Criterion release the other day of like, how dare they make this cover of this character, like super protective of the character. Like that's what the director wants. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, it's so strange. Like, does that kind of baffle you a little bit?
It does, but it's not being done in a way where the government is taking it away from you. So everybody is allowed to, it's something I always said. It's like, you know, you're allowed to be upset by this stuff existing and even shout from the rooftops about why you don't think people should be able to see it. But it shouldn't be the government taking it away from you. It shouldn't be the powers that be taking it away from you. By all means, debate amongst yourselves about this particular film and why you think it's wrong. And I'll tell you why I don't think it's wrong, or why I think I'm proud to have Emmanuel and the Last Cannibals on the label. You know, being from a product of its time, but definitely not something that I would definitely would be the first one to show somebody who wanted to see a Severin film, you know. But yeah, that's the fact that people are you know, up in arms about the Honora cover that's inspired by Vampiros Lesbos is kind of fascinating, honestly.
Yeah.
It's just like
It felt weirdly
protective of the character. Like there was one guy who was actually arguing who hadn't seen the film. He was just basically like, from what I've heard about the film, this takes away her agency and da, da, da. And it's like, what are you even saying? I don't, it's very hard to argue with you if you've made up your mind without actually seeing the film.
That's the weird...
Which actually was always often the case in the video nasties, is that the people hadn't actually seen the films. They just assumed that this was what was in them. And I completely understand, certain people being, horrified by some of the films that we champion. But that is their prerogative. But we do try our best, particularly with things that probably wouldn't be made now, like a lot of the Black Emmanuel films. We try to put context in there so that you do actually get to understand where this thing comes from, and it's not just blah, that's it. But still, if you just want to watch the movie, then that's your prerogative. But if you want some context, we try to put that on there too.
That's why I first saw that on Cinemax at probably 11 or 12 years old. Probably definitely way too young to see it. But imagine like seeing this and being like, okay, it's shocking because of the prurient content, but then it's like all of a sudden there's snuff footage in these movies. Made in America. It's like, where is this coming from?
And of course, I absolutely love that. Not even from the kind of analysis that Kayla was able to get on these is second to none, and exactly what they needed. But to me, I'm just like thinking of Joe D'Amato and his writer friend. I went to dinner with her before she died a few years ago, and I was asking like, who came up with the idea of snuff footage and a horse in basically an Emmanuel film? And like, who was that for? And she was just basically like, oh, Joe and I had a bottle of wine, and we're like, how can we mess with people? It was that simple. and that tickled me immensely.
I love that, where he's like, hey, I know that I'm Joe D'Amato and known for getting people excited during my movies. I'm also going to make you upset about it while you're watching it.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, and also, these might not be the kind of movies I want to make over and over and over. So let's keep it interesting. You know what I mean? He was a very cheeky chap. He obviously had an incredible sense of humor, and people loved him. I mean, he was a very inclusive director. He was a director who, gave a lot of people their start and a break into the industry, the first directing jobs like Michele Soavi, for example. Mm-hmm. And so, he's a guy who he knew what he was doing. Yeah. This wasn't some cynical just cash grab. He actually was like a very cheeky artist.
He's probably, it's hard to say who my favorite director, but he's up there in my favorites because it's just like, what a body of work and all over the place. Yeah. And it's like, and also you can pick any one of his 110 names and be like, oh yeah, okay, that's the one that I like.
Yeah. Now we have a lot more D'Amato coming. We're huge fans of D'Amato.
Awesome.
So you can tell, but we've got more coming.
I can't wait. I know you probably hate getting requests from people, but I figured I would use this last part of the interview to make my request.
Okay.
Thunder Warrior set is my dream Severin release, because that's never, outside of the VHSs, that's never come out.
Yes, and that's the trilogy that stars Mark Gregory, right?
Yes, yes.
So Marco Gregorio. They were directed under a pseudonym. Was it Larry Ludlam?
Yeah.
That was the pseudonym of Fabrizio De Angelis, who was the producer of Emmanuel in America and stuff like that. Problem with that is they're owned by MGM. And
that's what I figured.
But basically you've got to, if a title like that comes up, chances are it's owned by a studio, and a studio is just, first of all, it's too difficult to come to a reasonable arrangement with them for films like that. But secondly, they also don't let you do the kind of extras we would want to do on something.
Yeah. It's such a weird movie.
It's not going to happen through us.
Yeah. They're like Rambo ripoffs, but weird. Like Mark Gregory's such a weird actor to get into because where he's like not a traditional manly role, and yet he is pushed into these roles. And you're like, okay, he's Adam and Adam and Eve versus the cannibals, and you're like, oh, that's the original man is Mark Gregory. Okay.
Now, what do you think of that movie?
I love that movie. I think that movie's it's so weird, and I love that the American dub of it, the English dub has like the snake has the wildest accent. Like where did the devil get that accent? And supposedly what's the name of Mad Max directed the nature scenes from it that they stole.
George Miller?
George, yeah, that could be, as I call it, IMDb's. That could just be complete bullshit. But yeah, but I think that's fun. If you guys are putting that out, I would be joyous because that's a favorite too.
Saying nothing.
Okay. Well done. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I also wanted to thank you. You guys have put our site on the back of a lot of stuff. We're on the back of Rats and Hell of the Living Dead. And that means that legitimizes my decision to buy way too many movies and talk about them too much. So it's made me
I love that. It works both ways. That's fantastic.
Yeah. How many marriages have you broken up? That's my big question, because like that's the only thing my wife and I fight about, because I'll say, she'll say, what do you want for Christmas? I'm like, well, that Black Emmanuel box set would be very nice. And she's like, no, you're not.
I know. I like to think we bring people together.
I would like to think as well.
Open people's eyes to cinema that they never knew existed, and they may not like it, but it's a wild and wonderful world out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, and
My pleasure.
Love everything that's been put out. So this has been awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If you want to learn more, you can visit bnsaboutmovies.com. If you'd like to reach out to me, it's bnsaboutmovies@gmail.com. While you're at the site, we have our Ko-fi that you can make a donation if you'd like, and we'll do an entire episode about any movie that you'd like me to talk about. I say we in the royal we. It was really great to speak to David and learn that he has the same love for movies that we do. Again, I'm sure you heard the enthusiasm in my voice and the excitement to talk about really one of my favorite things in the world with him. Thanks for listening to the show. We have a lot of other episodes if this is your first episode coming in, and happy to have you here. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.